everyone. Here we are at the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum in person with Nina G. and by remote access to OJ Patterson, who's in Los Angeles, right, OJ?
Yes, that is correct.
You could be, I mean, you're kind of doing the I'm thinking of the guy who does the shows where he has the white space behind him. Oh my goodness. Okay.
John Oliver.
Thank you. Okay, doing the John Oliver. Okay, great. Moving on. Let's get on with this webinar. I want to make sure that we're letting people in right now, and we're going to be recording it, so it'll be available for posterity. And I want to turn it over to Nina and OJ for them to talk about their new book, The Bay Area Stand-Up Comedy.
All right. So thank you, Rena, and thank you for hosting this. We are in the Niles Film Museum, and it's been so great to spend the day here. I will talk a little bit about myself a bit later, but I wanted to introduce my co-author, OJ, and you want to say hi, and then I can start the slides. What do you want to do, OJ?
We're doing it. Hi, I'm OJ. I'm happy to contribute to this project. It's a real group effort, and Nina really knocked it out of the park. So yeah, let's do this.
All right, and OJ knocked it out of the park as well. So, and it really was. Martin, who was on, said that it felt like a family photo book. Well, like a family history. So I was like, yeah, because it is. So that's great. So OJ, tell me what we are looking at here.
Here we can see 3 instances of our friendship. We started doing comedy around the same time in 2010. Top left is us at the Brainwash Laundromat and Cafe. They also had public computers when that was still cool. And that particular night was very memorable because that was, I believe that was prom or spring fling. There was a lot of cool, kitschy comedy nights at the Brainwash. Especially at the ladies open mic, and they really made an impression on me. On the top right is Nina at her first show where she was on the poster. It was at 7 Mile House in Bayshore, and it was just like a cool kind of dive sports bar, but it meant a lot to see Nina do comedy there. And the bottom is us, at least me, at our open mic in Oakland at Kimball's, which was a warehouse, too big for an open mic, but we made it work. And yeah, that's how deep it goes and how long we've been doing it.
Yeah. And so I've been doing comedy for 12 years, and you've been doing, or you started about 13 years ago?
Yeah, tail end, I know the exact date, December 3rd, 2009, a little personal history.
All right, great. Yeah, and my anniversary is around now. I was so freaked out when I first started that I don't know when my anniversary is because it was such a weird, like I'm doing comedy. This is the thing that I always wanted to do, and I'm doing it, and I don't even know the date because I was so freaked out about it. But it's about now. So it was 12 years ago, somewhere between Valentine's Day and March 5th, somewhere in between there. So it's about now. And my own experience wanting to do stand up, and I'll show a picture here. I've just been a lifelong comedy fan, comedy nerd. I wanted to do it since I was around 11 years old. Since I'm a person who stutters, I didn't think that would be a possibility, and especially I grew up in the 80s, and I didn't have access to the internet, so I didn't know about this world of stuttering people, and that there were other possibilities. So dream died, picked it back up when I was 36 after a transformative conference that I attended. And within the year, I met OJ, and we hosted an open mic. That the most notable thing was that Cat was that Cat Williams almost got arrested, or he did get arrested right in front of the place. That was the most exciting thing that had happened there. Otherwise, yeah, a lot of jokes that did not land. So that was the other thing. OJ, can you say a little bit about why you started comedy and your relationship to it?
Yeah, comedy was always cool. It was always something that, my dad loved, my mom loved. And after coming home from college with a useless degree, I got to see some improv, a student group called Jericho at Berkeley. And it was a gateway of sorts. And yeah, I always had been writing jokes, and until I started knowing about San Francisco Bay Area comedy, I didn't think it was an accessible thing. I didn't think it was a part of like kind of the world around me, but it very much was. And I was happy that yeah, I got to slowly worm my way through and figure all this out, because there was a lot of things that were just like super impressive to me, enough to write a blog called Courting Comedy. And that's where I started the research for the book.
Yeah, no, and it's like both of us, it's the book felt like it was just kind of putting down stuff we'd been doing for a lot of our life and just kind of putting it onto pages, because it's like I found a paper from high school. I was like a sophomore in high school, and the paper was the history of stand-up comedy. And so this is something we've both been doing for a very long time. I think I wrote that paper before OJ was even born. Like, it's been that long. So it was 1987, I think. So there you go.
Got me by a year.
Yes. So, okay. So we wanted to acknowledge where we're at, which is the Silent Film Museum in Niles. And this is included in the book because at first I thought that this was where the first place that we would start the story, but it ended up that we got more information and we were able to start it even earlier. Now, the book is stand-up comedy. It is one or a couple of people up on stage with a microphone telling jokes. It's not sketch. Like, I love the Marx Brothers, but we are not doing the Marx Brothers. This is traditional stand-up. But it was still really important to include Chaplin in the book, in part because the roots, because of the comedy roots. Also, there is an open mic right down the street, and some of the behavior that Rena talked about that Chaplin had, such as not tipping and trying to do his material to the folks around here, stuff comics do all the time. So, and so there were those characteristics that were very much comedy characteristics. And so we wanted to bring that into the story. And also East Bay, everyone thinks San Francisco, East Bay, Fremont. That is where Chaplin filmed. Rena, this is where I need you to do checks. 5 films, right? 5 films. And what were those 5 films?
Those 5 films were A Night Out, which actually had some exteriors filmed in San Jose and Oakland as well, and the interiors were shot in Fremont, well, in Niles. There was no Fremont at that time. And then The Champion was a film where he's a boxer. That was filmed right here on the streets of Niles. You can still find locations for it. In the Park was a one-reeler, only 15 minutes long. It was filmed in North Lake at Golden Gate Park. A Jitney Elopement was filmed interiors here in Niles, but the exteriors were on the Great Highway and ended up at the Murphy Windmill at the edge of Golden Gate Park. And then The Tramp, and that was filmed in Niles Canyon and Niles proper. And again, there's locations that you can drive to or walk to right here in Niles.
And Niles was going to be like the Hollywood, right?
Well, that is what people like to say. It was a contemporary with Hollywood. It was actually making movies at the same time movies are being made in Hollywood. If we're talking about the first place that movies were made in the country, we have to tip our hats to Fort Lee, New Jersey, and also Orange, New Jersey. So they started east, came out west. So movies are being made in both Northern California and Southern California. Uh, Definitely, though, the most prolific film company that's, you could even say, in the Bay Area, even to this day, even if you throw all the Coppola, Lucas, Pixar, all those films together, you're still not going to match what was done in Niles between 1912 and 1916, as over 350 films, 1 and 2 reel films, were made right here. So we definitely can lay claim to that. Also, the very first cowboy movie star, Bronco Billy Anderson, was the A of SNA, and he was the director and the talent here in Niles. He hired Charlie Chaplin, and Chaplin had already been making movies at the Keystone Studio in Hollywood. Mabel Normand recommended to her boyfriend Max Sennett, who was running the studio, about this up and comer who was a vaudevillian. He was in vaudeville troupes that had been going across the United States from 1910 to 1914. Max Sennett hires him. He ends up being in 36 films for the Keystone Comedy Company. And then the rumor went out for a $10,000 signing bonus. He would sign with another company. So he went from $150 a week, which was really good money back in those days, to $1,250 a week, and did that for a year, and then ended up getting hired by another studio and such. So the bottom line is that he blew up here. He became world famous because of the films he made here in Niles. So, okay, maybe we're not the first Hollywood or the only Hollywood, but we definitely can be proud of the legacy that here in Niles.
And I want to hear why they stopped doing silent films in Niles.
Sure. So the main 2 reasons: one is they lost Chaplin. George Spohr out of Chicago didn't want to spend the money, even though he was obviously becoming very, very popular and such. But, he was a businessman, and he didn't want to pay he was going to be now needing to pay him $10,000 a week. Because when he signed with the mutual company, he ends up making $10,000 a week with a $100,000 signing bonus. And Spohr didn't want to spend that kind of money. So that's understandable. And then the other thing was he wanted to keep the films to be 15 minutes or half an hour long. Anderson wanted to expand into feature films, and that didn't work because money. So he said, just cash me out. So the studio closes in 1916, the very beginning of 1916, and that's why the movies ended up not happening here, because they tried to bring more movie companies into Niles. It just didn't happen. There was litigation about who owned the building, this, that. By the time they get everything sorted out, talking has come to the motion picture world. And when you're across the street, essentially, from the train tracks, and you're a train hub, and there's 24 trains going through Niles a day, it's just not going to work, because there's no such thing as a quiet studio. Even though films were silent, making them was not silent. Cameras sounded very loud. There was, hammering, construction, all kinds of things. It didn't matter for the silent world, but for talking pictures, it was going to be a real mess. So that's why it didn't stay in Niles.
Great. Thank you. I find it so interesting that the train was a thing that drove the film companies away. And those are the things that you just don't think about, because you get into your own world, into your own context, and you forget what it was like. And I think, OJ, who just got cut off, but he oftentimes says that comedy is like milk. There is a shelf life. And so sometimes comedy, if you miss the context, it's hard to understand that. And I think that is an important piece that we hoped to fill in some of those gaps there. I was going to have OJ talk about comedy in the East Bay, but since he disappeared, I'm going to go ahead and start here. When I first worked on the chapter that was pre the North Beach scene, I was like, okay, that's going to be Chaplin, and that's it. No, at the ninth hour of writing the book, I got to know the comic Rich Scheidner, who's been on Johnny Carson like 9 times in Letterman and specials and the whole thing. And he is a comedy historian in addition to a comic. And he loves this guy, Artemis Ward. And Ward was a comic. He was our first comic in the U.S. in the United States. So started comedy, so stand up comedy, and Ward was the first one. And he would get up and he would do these lectures, because at the time people would go see people do lectures, so it was kind of like a TED talk, but he would do it as like a joke. It was a very absurd version of a lecture. And so he toured doing these, and he did them in New York and on the East Coast, 1860s on the East Coast. Not great audiences. They were a bit down about a war going on. And so he went to the West, and in San Francisco, in Northern California, he found really great audiences who were receptive, and who were also, some of them were filthy rich. And the greenback was not great at the time. So he would get paid in gold rocks and like literal like gold. And that was the admission into the theater. And the theater in this picture is the McGuire Theater, which was it was on the outskirts of North Beach, and they actually had to tear it down to make way for Columbus. So I kind of imagine this somewhere around the Transamerica building. And this is where he performed. He would also go out to Sacramento, out to mining camps. And when he performed at the mining camps, they would light a bonfire. And that was the sign for people to come and enjoy the night and listen to some comedy. And then also he would play like the opera theater in Sacramento. And when he performed there, after performing at the mining camps, kind of got his audiences confused and kind of offended some of the higher class people, because he had just done the equivalent to a dive bar, so he could get down a little bit differently than he could at the opera theater. So this is the earliest comic in the Bay Area, and he was good friends, maybe not best friends, but really, really tight with Mark Twain. And Mark Twain's first time ever doing comedy, San Francisco. So very much they were connected there. So OJ, we always go and jump around. Since we were in the East Bay in Niles, I want to go. I want to stay in the East Bay before we go to San Francisco. Can you say a little bit about the scene in the East Bay? And we're going to jump now to the 1980s.
Yeah. So by the end of the 1970s into basically the mid 90s, there was a huge comedy boom where venues like the Jose Zoo and other cafe and Cobb's and Punchline all kind of started. But in another respect, a different revolution was happening, especially with the Black comedy scene of Oakland and San Leandro and with regards to Emeryville and Berkeley. Richard Pryor had previously kind of established a residency in Berkeley. He's one of, in addition to Chaplin, he's one of the people that we documented as they found a home in the Bay Area for a time, and that time was informative of their growth, and that growth informed the rest of the comedy world. And so Richard Pryor would do these one person kind of radio shows in Berkeley and became much more radicalized than what he was doing previously, which was essentially trying to do his own version of Bill Cosby or Dick Gregory. And then Whoopi Goldberg in the 80s, she would do a similar movement. She would be back and forth between East Bay and San Francisco, but in Berkeley, she would eventually, build the material that would become her one-person show, the Spook Show. She also cultivated a Mom's Mabley kind of review, a history of her life, which she continued until I think a few years ago with a documentary. And outside of that, from our discussions with Donald Lacey and with the producer slash manager for Jamie Foxx and Mark Curry, Marcus King, Oakland really developed its own voice, its own scene, and it was from the ground up. Like they were dealing with people who had never done comedy before, so it was a very in-person thing where you would go up to, they would usually reach out to women and say, hey, there's a cool comedy show. They, use their gift of gab and really be a force for the community and be a signal to like, hey, here's like, here's something that is new. This is noble. This is it's there's a novelty to it. They wouldn't use those words, but they would bring in people who had never heard of comedy before, who would never go to San Francisco to do stand-up. And that's where you get, Lunel. That's where you get so many Black comedians who would have trouble in San Francisco, but in Oakland, they got to be on the radio. They got to be on TV on was it Soul Beat? Which was the only Black owned television show or television network at the time. And then you get to the point where, because of the discrimination that they would face in San Francisco, Black producers such as Tony Spires would invent whole new things specifically with Black people in mind, including the Bay Area Black comedy competition. And there you could see anyone from D.L. Hughley to D.C. Curry. Mark Curry won it once. Jamie Foxx won it. So there was a lot of, smaller clubs, but it was very specific to the Cultural Revolution with hip hop, with Def Jam, with Def Comedy Jam. So Oakland was definitely a hub and still remains a hub for Black comedy, as much as San Francisco is for, kind of the esoteric comedy that it's known for. And it's definitely a legacy that should be known.
Yeah, and it's still developing too. So that is the thing, is that San Francisco and the Bay Area is constantly rediscovering itself. I think we have a very short history of where we've been as comics, and it's we are rediscovering it all the time, and that's why I think it's good to know what the roots of comedy are here. Now, I want to move into, we could talk about a lot of stuff, and I wanted to ask the audience at this point, is there anything that you are especially fond of in Bay Area comedy, or is there something you would especially like to hear about? Because I see some friends on here, and thank you to Deneen, who is here, who I know just got her book. So if there's anything people would like to hear about, that's great. But with that, Martin, I'm going to turn it over to you so that you could talk about the zoo and what it was like for you to be there.
Oh, thanks very much. My name is Martin Azevedo. I'm actually Rena's brother, but I wanted to chime in. I have a little bit of experience at the zoo. I did open mics at the Holy City Zoo when Will Durst opened it. He was the owner for a while, sort of after its heyday. It continued, but they were hosting open mics and comedy performances. I did come up. I really enjoyed the book, by the way. I wanted to say I really thought of it as a family album, as you said, of Bay Area comedy. And I, like many other people, grew up listening to the Alex Bennett Show, hearing these names became very, very familiar: Greg Proops and Dana Gould and Arj Barker and all these names. And so it was great to read the book and follow their story kind of from the beginnings through to the present day. You had so many interviews that I was excited about. I wanted to know uh, what interview were you most excited to get for your book?
OJ, you want to start with that first?
Yeah, I mentioned him early. Donald Lacey was invaluable to the book. He was, we knew him from just seeing comedy around. He was one of the more accessible, quote unquote, comedy legends. I mean, he is a legend, but I'm sure I'm sure he thinks he has a lot more in the tank, and he does as a creator. But he was a pathway to kind of the information about, shows that were going on, including the End Zone, and Kimball's East had or Kimball's West had a show for a while, and the Englander pub where this picture is from. And what was cool about him is that he was friends with one of my patron saints of San Francisco comedy, Warren Thomas. He was a Black comedian who he won the '87 San Francisco International Comedy Competition, which is the biggest and longest running, most respected comedy competition in the world, I think. And yeah, I never got to meet him, but as I was doing research for the blog that I was doing when I was a little bit younger, he just struck out to me as like, oh, this always existed. Like the kind of comedy that I always enjoy, kind of comedy that you could see with a W. Kamau Bell, with a Kasim Bentley, with a Corinda Dobbins, just like intellectual, but very, very, down to earth type of stand-up. He also had kind of like the Greg Proops, Stephen Pearl level of like speed to his comedy, and he was also a big riffer. So just knowing that, like, me personally, I was on the right path doing comedy in the Bay Area, and also later, talking to Donald Lacey, talking to Stephen Pearl about their time with Warren Thomas really helped regather what we lost when a comedian passes before their time.
Mm.
And I think for me, the one interview, and it was during the signing today, I met David Miller, who is the one who has this picture. And this picture was taken by someone else, but Miller has the rights now, and also he has a collection of flyers from the Intersection Coffee House. And the interview that I got to do was with Don Novello, or Father Guido Sarducci. And as someone from an Italian-American Catholic background who also loves comedy, whose family loves comedy, he's in my head, in my soul, he's half comic and half spiritual leader. So for me, he is both of those things. So to talk to him on the phone for an hour was so special. And the time that he was in San Francisco, to me, was so interesting because you had stuff going on in North Beach. You had the Hungry Eye, and you had these really special places that changed comedy. Then you had kind of this downtime in the 70s where the boom hadn't happened yet. There was not a full-time comedy club, but there was this weird little show in the basement of a church, that it was a ministry where they were trying to appeal to the young people. So they let them put on shows, and they let them show films, and the films that they showed included Chaplin, Betty Boop, Reefer Madness. So you get the kind of flavor of those films. And then they also invited comics, and Father Guido Sarducci was on that stage, as was Robin Williams, as was, and I can blow that up a bit. And so that is where they got their start to some extent. Robin Williams also was part of the very first comedy competition, which happened at the Intersection Cafe. And this is a flyer from year 2. Year 2 is when Dana Carvey won first place. But year 1 was when Robin Williams came in second place in 1976. 2 years after that, he would be on Mork and Mindy. I'm guessing second place might be better luck than first, because I forget who the first place was. But the Intersection, learning about that place was so interesting, and talking to Don Novello was so great, because like there were these 2 pivotal things that had happened in the development of this character. One was he bought a woman's opera cape, which is the one that he has here. He bought it at a St. Vincent de Paul, St. Vincent, Saint Catholic, okay, that, and it was for $7.50, and that would be the same cape that would be confiscated at the Vatican when he was arrested for impersonating a priest in 1980. He didn't get it back, and it is still at his house. I think it should be in the Smithsonian, and I told him that. And then the other thing is he developed this priest character in a church in the basement. And from there, he brought it to the boarding house. And that was I guess a club, a venue. And it had two floors. One was a bigger venue, and the one in the basement was where they did lots of comedy. And that was the first place that Carlin headlined in San Francisco, was at the boarding house. It's also the first place ever where Robin Williams ever headlined. And it's also where Don Novello developed his character by doing Q&A. So David, who had owned the boarding house, said, why don't you try this? And did Q&A, and that is what really helped him to get his character off the ground, which would then be on Saturday Night Live and lots of other shows too. So those were our favorites. What else, Martin? Because I know you have some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great. So the book has so many wonderful anecdotes. I mean, there was Henny Youngman performing at Kung Pao Kosher Comedy, and it was the only time his grandkids ever got to see him perform. And Robin Williams calling Larry Bubbles Brown to encourage him after a TV gig fell through. Did you have a favorite anecdote that you picked up in your research, or something that really surprised you?
What do you think, OJ? I'm trying to think of one specifically?
I think a lot of it was recall for me. I wrote primarily the section that starts with almost losing Cobb's and ends with almost losing the punchline. And in between, I got to interview a lot of my contemporaries, but also the people before me who kind of made the infrastructure for what comedy currently is. A lot of independent shows, a lot of interfacing with the clubs. It all kind of coalesced in the early 2000s. And what it was a ball to remember was for a brief time, comedy returned to 408 Clement Street, formerly known as the Holy City Zoo. And for about 2 years, a stand-up troupe, they, put on shows. They had an open mic every Wednesday, and they had shows Wednesday, Saturdays and Sundays. And one night, the open mics were pretty loose. The host would not, he would give a lot of time, mostly because he wanted to smoke. He actually had found out about 408 Clement Street. There's no like marker there. There's no plaque. So he actually heard from the bartenders, the owners of the club, of the venue, that, oh yeah, Robin Williams used to perform here, and it was a good time. He came here when we were young. So that's what inspired them to do the shows there, and the bar acquiesced because of the history. And yeah, it was a very loose, sloppy, kind of just like young person's open mic until one night when Robin Williams came to the open mic, and it was this big deal. But he was just like, no, I don't want to perform. I'm just here to watch. This is beautiful. This is capturing some of my youth. I used to spend a lot of time here. And then the next week, he shows up and he does a set, and it's one of those like, with sometimes San Francisco audiences, especially open mics, when like there's a famous drop in, it's like very exciting. But this was on another level, except for like Robin during the set was like, "Oh, don't film this. I don't want anyone to film this. Let's stay in the moment." Everybody acquiesced pretty much, but except for one person, an open mic comedian named Sweet Gail, who is notorious in the scene. If you have done stand up in San Francisco, you know her, and she's still filming him. And this is like an icon. This is Robin Williams, who built, through his reputation, a lot of the infrastructure that made the boom possible in the Bay Area, and has given numerous money to comedy clubs and Comedy Day and all this other stuff. He's like, please stop filming me. And this, this cranky older woman was just like, no, tell your jokes. You're Robin Williams. So you just have this beautiful intersection of open mic at its finest with Sweet Gail and like one of the most famous comedians of all time at Robin Williams, and they're yelling in a dive bar in the inner Richmond. And I always thought that was a pretty funny juxtaposition of how high and how low stand-up comedy can take you in the San Francisco Bay Area.
So I'm sorry to interrupt the flow here, but there's someone who would like to make a purchase. Is there someone that
We'll take care of that.
okay. Someone's coming. So, okay.
Blink your eyes. They're in the building. Okay.
Okay.
I had another question. So you wrote this book after doing comedy for years, having developed a style, having developed an understanding of what you're doing. What did you learn about comedy from writing the book?
I think for me, there were some reminders of why I love comedy and the kind of comedy I love, and to kind of take me back to that. One of the things that I really love is like, it's the absurdity and the going on and on and on about something. And that's where where the interview with Donald Lacey reminded me of that, where he talked about how Warren Thomas would talk about wringing something out, that you just wring out the rag as much as you can, and you let the audience tell you when when it stopped. And so that is why I think I got reacquainted with that love. And for me, just being reminded of that was important. OJ?
Um, I I think the most important thing to know about comedy is that you know nothing about comedy, not in a real way. I think doing research for the book really influenced and highlighted the fact that stand up has existed in ways that I couldn't have predicted. Like, for instance, I got another patron saint of stand up comedy for me is a comedian by the name of Jane Dornacker. And she was this tall, absurd, kind of ephemeral comedian who could kind of weave in and out of the rock space, like rock music scene and the stand-up scene. She could do the punchline. She could do the Valencia roast. She was everywhere. She was everything. She was ended up being a newscaster, and her style of comedy can be seen in Ali Wong, Mary Van Note, Caitlin Gill, Marcella Arguello, every comedian that I could, Margaret Cho. There's so much like cool counterculture that's just like deep, like seeped into the roots of San Francisco. And if you tap into that, you're actually tapping into a spirit that can go as far back as, a Steve Martin, as far back as a Smothers Brothers. And so just keeping an open mind and being, really curious about where comedy came from and also what you can accomplish with it is an invaluable lesson that researching and writing the book gave me. But also you kind of know in the Bay Area, if you come to the Bay Area, you can't be a hack. It's just too many different people. There's too many different styles of comedy. You don't want to step on anybody's toes because it's the level of camaraderie in San Francisco. And yeah, you Bay Area stand up has reconfirmed, time and time and again, like this is where you come to develop. This is where you can have like an impasse or you can have a critical mass in your career. But nonetheless, like you have the time. Dan St. Paul said it best. Comedians in San Francisco can't give you a tight 5. They're not all ready for, a late night set, but they'll give you a solid 20. And it's just because there's so much stand-up time and there's so much ambition and so many different varieties of people that, of course, you're going to be very different than someone who came from Denver or Chicago or Atlanta or some places that are a little bit more homogenous.
Wow.
And we haven't gotten a whole lot of questions or comments from our audience, so please do feel free and let us know. There was one thing that I wanted to share that kind of surprised me, and also so many great pictures came out of this discovery, and that is that so this is Cobb's Comedy Pub. Cobb's is right now this massive venue, kind of almost where North Beach ends and Fisherman's Wharf begins, and it's probably the biggest comedy venue in the Bay Area. It started at this little teeny tiny local bar that sat 100 people, and it was in the Marina district, and you could see here who was headlining that time in the mid 80s. And you have Jeremy Kramer, you have Larry Miller, you have Jerry Seinfeld, you have Ellen, Mark Pitta, and you also have you had a Whitney Brown. And here is what it looks like inside. You may see the blonde-haired woman who people are mad at right now there. So that is Ellen. And this is what it looked like then. And then it went to the cannery, and then it went on to where it's at now. And what I did not know is that it was started by a group of women. So the club itself, or the bar itself, it was already there. But the people who started it were the Femprov. And Femprov had lots of different people in it at one time or another. The woman who I spoke to and who gave me a lot of these pictures was Janine Hansen, and she's the one who took the Cobb's pictures that I just showed. And she is an archivist. She says she's a hoarder, but she's really an archivist because she has hoarded very well. And she has tapes from people at Cobb's through the 80s. She has Bobcat. She has so many folks that it is there and it's ready to be archived. And so she was just a wealth of information. And she told me about the Femprov and how the women there started Cobb's. And then it eventually kind of went on its own. But also, one of the women who started Cobb's also helped in the creation of the Valencia Rose. And the one who really put the Valencia Rose on the map was Tom Amiano, who is, or ended up to be, also a politician. First, he was a special ed teacher, and he started comedy and helped to get the Valencia Rose off the ground as a cabaret. And he had gay comedy night. And this is where people like Marga Gomez came out of. Because in the 1980s, like, you remember Andrew Dice Clay and some of the comics like that, who were a little kind of a lot phobic, and wasn't always a comfortable place for someone who was LGBT to be and to develop their own voice and their own authenticity. And that's why you had many people who were in the closet for a very long time. But this was the place when Marga went here. She said that she was able to bring her whole self into it. And this was where Whoopi also developed her act. This is where a lot of people who like, they curated a certain kind of comedy that their patrons liked. And Leah Delaria, who was on Orange is the New Black, she was the very first stand-up comic to be on a late night show. And she was on the Arsenio show, and she was brought out to the dog pound where they go woo 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 woo. I don't know if people remember that or not, but it was a big thing. And she was embraced, and he really had to go to bat for her because she said some words that the network was not very happy about, and he really put his foot down and said, no, you're going to play it as is. And so those were two clubs that I didn't know the origins stories of, and I think that it also kind of points to the diversity of San Francisco and of our comedy. And OJ, you always say it so well about how that diversity impacts both the comic who comes from that community, but also those who don't, and the impact on them as well. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the Bay Area benefits from a number of things that make it a unique comedy scene. The educational opportunities in terms of colleges has brought in, anyone from Shang Wang, who went to UC Berkeley, to you know, a wealth of our Emily Heller, Jesse Elias from UC Santa Cruz. There's just a lot of comedy energy in that way because it's an intellectual pursuit, and what was cool to find out or reconfirm, you know, time and again, is that in addition to, just people being naturally, like, born here, and the people who come to San Francisco, whether it be the um, kind of the Black migration and different immigration waves into the city that just makes the city the city. You have what I'd say a unique social experiment in comedy, in that the people who come here usually don't come here for comedy. The people who go to San Francisco, who come to the Bay Area, they're usually looking for like a certain opportunity. And when that kind of changes, or they hear about comedy, they hear about the scene, you're suddenly placed into a, I wouldn't say like a Shangri-La, but you're meeting people who you wouldn't have met in any other circumstance. And because stand-up comedy in the Bay Area is based on like respect and kind of notoriety, and you're trying to move ahead without stepping on people. You just have a mutual respect. And so I can meet someone from a completely different walk of life. I can meet, Nina, and be really educated and learn and metastasize, just because she's so funny, a lot of like, oh, like this comedy club isn't accessible. That's a problem. And now that's expanded my frame of reference. It's the same thing with, I can meet a Natasha Muse, or I can meet a Nico Santos, or a you know a Daya Lakshmi Naranayan, and just now I have a touchstone for comedy. Like, comedy for me has always been one of the best educational tools you can have, because when someone does stand up, they're just expressing themselves, and everyone has a different experience. So if you go to an open mic, a showcase, if you're in the scene for, X amount of years, you're gonna know those people. You're gonna meet those people. You're gonna befriend those people, and you're gonna be given a perspective that the region really cultivates by being, a little bit more intellectual, a little bit more conscious, a little bit more mindful, so that even if you're just like some, Joe Schmo white male comedian, you're gonna have at least a texture of knowledge to your comics. Now, you may step on some toes with your punchline, but you're definitely it's going to come from a place of knowing, which I don't think can be understated. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about Bay Area as a region, but also as a comedy scene.
Yeah, and I think in the past few years, there's been less opportunities for comics to perform in places that are ever since Dorsey's locker closed, it feels like there's this void of being able to go to rooms that are culturally different from yourself. And I don't feel there's that as much of that as there was 10 years back. And I think in a way it's gotten a little more segregated, but there's always going to be the clubs that have a sprinkling of everyone. And it's not always it's the same opportunities for everyone, but that still is there. I mean, I would love to see more working disabled comics, which right now there isn't one who is hosting anywhere. And so those are the kinds of limitations I see, but also we're here, whereas we may not be in some other communities. And because we do have an activist background here amongst so many groups, that it's hard to shut us up. So that's also great. So I have invited Deneen to, she thinks she's going to ask a question, but I'm going to ask her a question. So is that okay? Okay, so Deneen, take yourself off mute. I know you know how to do this. I'm going to ask you your own question, okay? I'm going to ask you. Can you speak more about, uh, uh, can you speak more to comedy during the pandemic? And where do you see the future of Zoom and online comedy shows or events? Deneen, can you answer your own question?
I can, because that I was tickled to see that in the, I liked it, sanitized comedy. And I just have to say, by the way, this book is, the quality is amazing. This is a well, not just because you guys signed it and wrote to me, but no, great job all around, very pro, and this is a collector's item. I will cherish this forever. I was as a stand-up comedian audience member, and from the East Bay, I saw a lot of those shows and always loved it. My renaissance was really when I first moved to San Luis Obispo, small community, but I guess I had kind of missed out with the new millennium with the new comedy scene that's going on now. So I started in the small town getting to meet people. Then the pandemic hit, but I've always been a computer person anyway. And we had web meetings at work. And I've met so many of you guys that I've met Nina in person, but I haven't met OJ, but I have so many of you as I call it my comedy family, that I've met just purely online. I feel if I met you guys in real life, it would just be like we are now, which was when Nina G and I met. It was just like, hey, how you doing? So I hope it keeps going.
Family. So that's a whole other thing. We were like almost family, but that's a whole East Bay, like Catholic, Irish, Italian thing. So we aren't going to get into that, but we're proud.
You mentioned you both spoke to also the Zoom, where it became also more than just the audience sitting there and you want to listen, not be a heckler, but it was more interactive. So I just kind of blossomed with that too, and made so many, and I just loved all the different, like you said, the game shows. You did the Bucci's, the drive-in comedy. And I was, you and Mean Dave and Cynthia in Public and so many were the forerunners of that, because a lot of my, kind of local comedian friends were not on board with that at all. So that impressed me. It's like you have to survive and thrive, and not just roll over dead. So I hope it keeps going. I actually haven't been out. I've been working a lot, but I haven't really, it's a different scene now to me. I mean, I will go back to live comedy, but I find myself just really liking to just put on my jammies and get my wine and just sit on the couch and turn on my computer and go to a nice comedy show.
And I think that, with like fires in California and possible other pandemics or just weird stuff that happens, that like when comedy is not accessible, we're going to have a framework to make it accessible. And I'm finding that a lot of colleges are doing stuff online because their students are not coming to the school, but they still want to have a fun thing, which is great because I get paid for an hour of work and I don't have to go anywhere. And so it works out well. But I think that I don't, when the pandemic first happened, I was really interested to know what comedy was like during this Spanish flu and the impact on vaudeville and humor, and did humor change? I couldn't find anything on it. And that's also what kind of drove me to research more or to document more about the pandemic and comedy now. And April 1st of 2021 was when Gotham opened and Jerry Seinfeld stepped onto the stage. So I kind of saw that as the marker of we're coming back. It was very slow, but we're coming back. Mm-hmm. But I do wonder if Zoom will always have its place. And if it doesn't have its place, it can quickly go back to that place. And I think for me, what Zoom helped me do was have conviction in my work, that like you perform to the void, that not everybody is Deneen who will give you feedback. She always is good for a laugh or like a thumbs up, just like that. And not everybody is. And so you have to know that your stuff is good, or at least believe in it, or at least fake it. And that has helped me on the stage now, that I'm better able to perform because of that. And I think Zoom and the Zoom audiences, thank you, all, were the ones who had helped us through that. And I really think there's a term that Dina, who is a producer in San Jose, used, which is comedy Darwinism, which was during the pandemic, will some adapt and some die. And that is part of what I think we saw.
But I thought the more, and also I will take more of your time, but I met some more of your, the disabled comics on your, or, I don't mean it that way, but, it's more maybe for sometimes.
We had a show of disabled comics.
Yeah, so. Yeah, but sometimes, like you said, with the accessibility, they can be more accessible online to a bigger audience. And I was just blown away by, a lot of Michael Beers and Jade, and I mean, I just saw more comedy. You know me, I went to all these different comedy shows and I loved it. I mean, comedians from different countries. So for me, it's a gourmet comedy scene via Zoom, because you can just go everywhere and see people, and even catch up with some old friends like Griffin and people that I didn't get to see live anymore for a while.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm going to jump in for a second here, just letting you know we're at the 1 hour mark. And then also we have found that having our online programs, we now have supporters and fans across the country. Never would have thought that. I mean, we suddenly have members of our museum that are from New York and Texas, and we're like, man, oh yeah, we're doing online programs. That's right. But I am curious though, if you're doing online program or online comedy, do you make everybody have all their sound on so you can hear the laughter, but then you also hear things you may not want to hear? And do you tell everybody to mute, and then you're not hearing their laughter, so you're having to look for faces, the facial expressions? Okay, they must be enjoying this. I mean, I don't know how that would play out.
Yeah, and it played out all those ways, because also it's a Zoom bombers, so you had to make 2 or 3 people host, so someone can kick someone out, and then you would always look like, okay, who has the weird name, who has something that is some sign that they're gonna come on, and you're gonna see a male body part that you don't want to see, because a lot of Zoom shows had that. And so we always
I wanted to see them. I don't get an opportunity.
Well, there was puppetry of the penis, online, on stage.
Yes.
Maybe that's your version.
That's the next Zoom show. And so it was always, that was the first thing. I always had lots of anxiety there. But sometimes you would have the mics on. Sometimes you would just mute people, because there was always that thing like, okay, we can hear your conversation, please stop. And that kind of interrupts it's a flow of the jokes. I always, when I do these things, especially for colleges, I will say, please put in the chat, because I need your validation. So please put in the LOLs, all of that. And so those were some of the tools. But yeah, it's been a great way to connect with, because I've done like open mics in India. I woke up at like 8:30 and did a set in India, because there's a disabled comic there and I love her and I wanted to be on that. And also I could say I performed in India, even though kind of not.
it just, I'll make it real quick, and I'm keep interrupting, but it made me, I always used to be kind of an asshole, with being funny in the audience, and it's about the comedians. So it's made me actually a better audience member in person, being more quiet, which is my thing, to be quiet and listen and not interrupt a lot. So
Yeah,
I'm
interesting.
going to mute myself now.
Okay. And Rena, I'm going to put it back to you. I know there's so much because we didn't get into the North Beach scene. We didn't get into Lenny Bruce and some of that history. But where would you like to go? Any other questions? Any burning thoughts? And I invite anybody else who is on here, Michael, Margaret, Jim, Kristen, and Karen, if there's anything else that you all wanted to add.
Well, I am concerned for you because I want to make sure that you get to your gig, because we did this at 4 p.m. so you could get to your gig in the city. So we can, I feel like there is a lot more to cover, but perhaps we can add a slideshow that you can do without an audience, that you could just talk straight through it. And we can add that to our website. And people may wonder, what's the connection for Bay Area comedy? And the nice thing for me is if any of our board members here at the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum have an interest, like whether it's radio plays or comedy or what have you, we're able to address that. And there is always some way to connect the dots with our mission, our main focus. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are at the very beginning of a capital campaign. We're raising money so our 100-seat theater can be more authentic. And we hope to start screening films again by summertime. This pandemic really threw a monkey wrench in the works, but our store and our museum are open from 12 to 4 on Saturdays and Sundays. So we do hope people come to Niles, the historic district of Niles in Fremont, California, just down the road from Oakland and San Francisco and San Jose the other way. But there is so much to cover. I can say that comedy roots go deep in San Francisco. I feel like you addressed a lot of different things, and for the sake of time, we can call this to a close. And if anybody, unless somebody has, like you said, burning questions, and then hopefully we'll pick this up again soon. So I think with that, I'm not seeing anything more, and I'm having a really tough time with my I'm using an old computer and it's the green screen. So this is what happened. I moved the darn thing. I'm going to stop. I want to go offline here. Okay. See comedy people. It's all these comedy people from, we're going to be doing a program in Jacksonville very soon. Oh my gosh. Can we close now? Go back to you.
No, I think that is the perfect time.
Oh,
thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you being here. And OJ, any last words?
Just it's a little bit complicated these days, but there's always a way. Comedy will always find a way. It's the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. There will always be some way to support live stand-up, support stand-up comedians, and learn about comedy history.
So OJ, if you are not doing comedy because you've retired from the profession, what are you doing with comedy so we can know to keep in touch with you?
Oh, the book was a major undertaking, so I'm gonna take a little time to figure it out. I've put some of the best articles I've written over the years on courtingcomedy.com. So find that. I also have a Patreon for that. And yeah, I'll keep people updated as things kind of quiet down. But comedy, you'll never stop being a comic. Tom Amiano said that the venue just changed. I'm still a stand-up even when I'm at the state capitol. So I take that to heart. I take, Rodney Dangerfield taking a 10-year break between when he started stand-up and when he became Rodney Dangerfield. So, if you hear a big guttural laugh at the back of the punchline, just know that that's me. and I'm always going to be around. So I hope that I see you out there.
Yeah, that thanks everybody, and please check out the book, and please come to more things at the Niles Museum. It's a great place.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.